share this information with here right now, but who would want to, learn about the different issues related to our topic today. So if you're okay with that, that would be great. And if there's any issues, just reach out to me by chat function. Thank you. All right, and with that, I'll officially welcome all of you to today's session. Thank you so much for joining us at the Center for Human Rights Talks. We're very excited to have everyone with us today. I'll just start with a brief introduction. So my name is Sevim Saadat. I am the co-founder of the Center for Human Rights. I'm a graduate of Cornell University and have been working in Pakistan for the last 6.5 years or so. I forget at this time. But it's been great. I work predominantly in the criminal justice sector, human rights and policy and legal reform. And I'm also a lecturer for international protection of human rights at Universal College Lahore. So I have a great panel with me today, and that includes 3 awesome people with some really interesting stuff for us to listen to today. First, we have Fatima Mehmood, who is a human rights officer at the Center for Human Rights and is the author of the research report under discussion today. Fatima is a graduate of Harvard Law School and University of London. She has experience in legal and policy research and advocacy and has previously worked with the Harvard Law School program on international law and armed conflict and the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, among other organizations. Fatima is also a lecturer for public international law and jurisprudence and legal theory at Universal College Lahore. Welcome, Fatima. And next we have with us Khwaja Isaam bin Harris, who is an advocate of the High Courts of Pakistan based in Lahore. He is a graduate of University College London and University of London. Isaam is a partner at Law Concern, where he practices centers around where his practice centers around constitutional administrative law, advising and representing both governmental authorities, departments, as well as private clients, and having rendered assistance on a range of constitutional issues, including public health, education, federalism, anti-discrimination, and environmentalism. He lectures on equity and trust and administrative law at Universal College Lahore as well. Welcome, Isaam. And finally, we have with us Mark West, who works in UNESCO's education sector, where he examines how technology can improve the quality, equity, and accessibility of learning, especially in developing countries. He is a graduate of Stanford University. He leads work on UNESCO's Global Declaration on Connectivity for Education and has spent the past 2 years analyzing lessons learned from country attempts to shift education from schools to connected technologies as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. His 2019 report, "I'd blush if I could," led Apple and other technology firms to make major changes to the way Siri and other AI assistant projects project gender. Prior to joining UNESCO, Mr. West researched education in Azerbaijan as a Fulbright Fellow and worked as a teacher and teacher trainer in the US. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited to be moderating this session. And just for all of our participants, thank you so much for being here with us. We really want to keep this session interactive. So what we're going to do is we're going to have speakers talk a little bit. Oh, sorry. So there's a poll first. I'll stop. As you'll see, I'm moderating because I like to speak and also because I'm a lawyer, both of those things. So we have a poll up on your screens right now. We just request if you could quickly fill this in and just click submit and we'll get the answers. Like I was saying, we are trying to keep this interactive as much as we can. COVID has really taken that part of our life sort of away from us, but we're trying to reclaim that space as well as we move through this pandemic. So how this is going to work, I'm just going to hand it over to our speakers to talk a little bit about a few different areas of work. The broader aim of, bringing everyone together today is to really unpack what the immediate and long-term impact of COVID-19 on education globally and locally in Pakistan is. We're looking into, how are we going to reimagine this right to education to be more inclusive of internet accessibility, some of these things which have been directly pointed out through the pandemic. And also, of course, we're here to launch one of our publications, which has been authored by Fatima. So that is why we're all here today. Thank you so much for being here. We have a question and answer session towards the end of this webinar, but I would really also urge you to feel free to drop any questions you have as our speakers are going forward with their presentations in the chat box, and we'll make sure to put them up once they're done with that. So with that, I'll hand it over to Fatima, and you can take it from here. Thanks.
Thank you, Sevim. So I'd just like to begin by sort of really unpacking the content of the report that is under discussion today. So this report is on bridging the digital divide in education during COVID-19. And I'd just like to walk our audience through the different aspects and the different facets of this report. Broadly, this report is divided into 3 distinct components, and I'm just going to walk you through what each of these components entails and what the key findings of our report have been. So the first part deals with understanding the problem relating to the digital divide in education during COVID-19, specifically in Pakistan. And in this first part, we sort of try to tackle 3 distinct areas, which is, so firstly, we start with mapping out and documenting COVID-19 induced school closures in Pakistan. And then we also use data and statistics on the digital divide in Pakistan to understand what the situation has been like in education during COVID-19. So in terms of the digital divide, what we found out was that while there is a marked general digital divide in Pakistan, which has been proven both through domestic and international sources, and that digital divide has a bunch of different layers. So it is based on gender, it is based on income, it is based on socioeconomic status, it's also based on disability status, and there are a bunch of other layers as to the existing digital divide in Pakistan. So that general sort of digital divide we saw has now seeped into specific digital divides in various sectors, including education. And through understanding what the impacts of education, impacts of COVID have been on education, and also simultaneously through understanding what the status of the digital divide has been like, we reached the conclusion that while this digital divide pre-existed the pandemic, so it was always there and is even there in education, it was exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the sort of discrimination and the inequality that it previously created was heightened because of the pandemic. Because on one hand, you had students who were resorting seamlessly to virtual modes of instruction, and it didn't, for all practical purposes, matter whether their physical classrooms were shut or not, because they were getting more or less the same modes and methods of teaching through virtual learning. But at the same time, you had students who could not even access these virtual forms because of lack of access to the internet in the first place. And therefore, the sorts of options that were present for them, all the remote learning options that were made available since the beginning of the pandemic, including teleschool, including radio school, where pre-recorded lessons were shown to these students at select hours of each day, and students could sit in front of their televisions or radios and watch or hear these sessions. Now, while we understand that those sort of solutions might have been adequate in the short term in response to a pandemic, and they were very, very necessary, and they were much appreciated in the short term, the entire purpose of this publication and of this whole project is to go beyond those short-term reactionary measures and look towards something that's more sustainable. And to that end, we use the information that is documented in part 1 of this report in order to propose in part 2 a right to internet access, specifically as part and parcel of the right to education in international human rights law. Now, when we say that, firstly, in the report, we went through relevant international human rights law instruments in trying to understand where, if at all, a right to internet access can fit in either independently or within the right to education enshrined in these instruments. And we came to the conclusion that the existing rights to education enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as the Child Rights Convention, they are so broadly phrased that they can be interpreted to include a right to access the internet. So they already include elements of accessibility and adaptability, which is why in the report, our findings are that a right to internet access can be read into the existing rights to education already enshrined within the CRC and the ICSCR. Now, that said, it's also important to understand that it's not just about entrenching a right to internet access. So the publication goes a bit further in also trying to sort of lay down the contours broadly of what this right should entail. So we don't intend to lay down a definition of such a right, but we do intend to lay down some bare minimum thresholds or components of such a right that we advocate should be considered in the formulation of such a right. So firstly, in the report, we point out that a negative duty with regards to internet access has perhaps already crystallized in international human rights law, because the negative duty not to interfere with internet access is sufficiently recognized with regards to civil and political rights like freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of right to access information. However, what's missing is an affirmative positive duty on states. And it is our first recommendation that any right to internet access in education should contain an affirmative positive duty on states as well, in addition to the negative duty not to interfere with that particular right. And what should be the core constituent of this affirmative positive duty? Firstly, we believe that a resource commitment is very, very necessary, because internet access is constituent of access to internet-enabled devices, access to infrastructure, because all of these things ensure that access to internet doesn't just exist in a vacuum, and it's actually made meaningful. So a resource commitment towards infrastructure is very, very important, and so is an obligation of non-discrimination. We want this right to be seen in a manner by governments that they understand the nuances of the digital divide, and they understand exactly which sectors of the population are specially affected or have been specially affected, and take special steps to cater to their lack of accessibility. So that obligation of non-discrimination is very, very important, and it's going to become even more important in the sort of recovery of the education sector from the pandemic. And last but not the least, we also believe that with this right also comes a responsibility, and that responsibility is to ensure that learners, instructors, educational institutions don't just have access to the internet and they don't just know how to use the internet, but they also know how to use the internet in a safe and secure way. So internet literacy and training programs should form part and parcel of this right to access the internet in education, so that governments can take positive steps towards ensuring that this obligation is essentially implemented with regards to the population. So that said, in part 2 again of this report, we propose that international human rights law, the right to education already entrenched in international human rights law, should encompass a right to internet access. And we've mentioned the 2 different international human rights law instruments that are already capable of doing so. We outline the various contours of this potential right, and in the report in detail, we also highlight some of the foreseeable roadblocks to implementation. So that can also be used to sort of steer some advocacy efforts. Now, moving on to part 3. In part 3, we move from the international human rights plane to the domestic plane, and we conducted a comparative study of constitutions, legislations, judicial decisions, and policy frameworks across the world, which were relevant to internet access generally and internet access in education. And you can see on the screen the various countries we studied in each of these 4 different categories. Now, out of these, I'd just like to briefly highlight what we thought were some of the most important or some of the strongest protections of the right to internet access. So in terms of constitutions, it was our finding that the Constitution of Ecuador offered the most expansive protection afforded to internet access as compared to the Greek and Portuguese constitution, because it enshrined a very, very clear affirmative duty on government to provide internet access. And similarly with legislation, we found that the Estonian laws that we analyzed offered the most detail on exactly what the government is obliged to do in terms of internet access. And there were specific provisions, for example, relating to an obligation to ensure internet access for disabled end users. In terms of judicial decisions, the French and Indian decisions that we analyzed mostly dealt with the freedom of expression and how internet access forms part and parcel of that civil and political right. But the Costa Rica judgment was very, very interesting in the sense that it specifically talked about internet access as a facilitator of a range of rights. So not just civil and political rights, but a number of economic, social, and cultural rights, including education. So we thought that that was very, very important to highlight. In addition, we analyzed the Kerala policy framework, and that was very important because it is the clearest entrenchment of internet access, specifically in human rights terms, in a policy framework, that too within the South Asian context. So part 3 basically then analyzed all of these comparative protections with a view to making recommendations for each of these contexts in Pakistan. So this comparative study was done towards the end of making recommendations for the Pakistani constitution, legislation, as well as judicial and policy frameworks. With that said, before we move on to my fellow speakers, I'd just like to highlight the sort of methodology behind both talking about international human rights law on one hand and talking about domestic protection mechanisms on the other hand. So we believe in the report, and this is something we've highlighted throughout, that it's very important in order to ensure that the protection of this right is sustainable and holistic, that it's very important to combine this top-down international recognition on the international plane with bottom-up domestic entrenchment of a right to internet access. So while recognition in international human rights law is important because it sets a universal yardstick, it sets a universal benchmark for states to follow, at the end of the day, it is states which have to implement and enforce and entrench that right. So then it's equally important for states to sort of mirror that international protection and have domestic protection mechanisms that correspond to that international level of protection. And it is the combination of both of these, international and domestic, that we strongly believe can provide a sustainable solution to the problem of the digital divide in education during and after the pandemic. With that said, I would now like to pass it on back to Sevim so she can introduce the other speakers who will now be joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatma. So Mark, are you still here? If yes, I can hand it over to Mark. I just thought it would be really useful to get a little bit of insights with Fatma's last slide, going forward. What is the global impact of COVID-19 on education? And particularly, we're interested to learn a little bit more about UNESCO's Futures of Education initiative and what the interplay of COVID, education, and technology has been. So I think it would be really helpful to get some of your insights on that now. Thank you, and over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sevim, and thank you, Fatima. I just wanted to say congratulations to the Center for Human Rights. It's a fantastic report. Fatima, congratulations for authoring such an interesting analysis. I can tell you, some of my colleagues and I who are here on this call today, we've read literally thousands of reports about sort of what happened when education moved from schools to connected technology. And it's rare to see a piece that really breaks through and says something that's very interesting. And I think this proposal about perhaps elevating a right to connectivity as a branch to the right to education is a really interesting proposal. It's sparked a lot of thought, and congratulations to the center for this important output. It certainly shaped some of our own thinking here at UNESCO about this important issue. If I can maybe just go through some of our sort of reflections on this. I mean, the exclusion that Fatima identified, the part one of the report, it is immense. It's difficult to overstate it. By our analysis, most learners were unable to access distance and remote forms of education globally, especially if that's considered to be digital. I mean, even when you look at TV and radio, that's a little harder to really pin down accurately, but certainly through the sort of digital technologies that people expect, and that being a more rich educational experience, most people were locked out. So making education contingent on connectivity and digital devices is a sure way to exclude not just some people, but a global majority of students. So that is problematic. We also saw this immense inequity that emerged. So it was a case of sort of supercharging inequalities, where people who have internet access are often, already privileged in other ways. So their education was able to sort of continue, whereas everybody else's, at least formal learning, more or less came to a standstill. We know that there are huge inequities across countries. I mean, just to give you a few examples, the cost of devices can vary enormously country to country. When you look at that as a factor of income, it can, be incredibly different. Just to give you a few extremes, I mean, in some countries, the cost of the least expensive smartphone is a small fraction of somebody's monthly income. In other countries like Sierra Leone, it's about 600% of somebody's monthly income, which means that that person would have to save 100% of their earnings for 6 months in order to just afford a device. That has to do with issues of taxation and, of course, of income and poverty in the country. When it comes to connectivity itself, there's enormous differences between countries. So for instance, 1 gigabyte of mobile data in Italy costs about 25 US cents. 1 gigabyte of data in Madagascar costs about 15 US dollars. It costs about $5 in Madagascar, about $15 in Yemen, and close to $25 in Mali. And then again, if we consider people's incomes in those countries, it can become even more sort of problematic. So during COVID, we obviously saw, that education did sort of overnight, in an instant, became reliant on these connected technologies. And we're going to be coming out with a major, it's a book that really looks at sort of what happened when this occurred. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of that decision, yes, it's necessary. Governments immediately discovered it was very necessary to close schools. But looking at a lot of the analysis, there was quite a bit of evidence starting in mid-2020 and certainly late 2020 that it was okay to open schools. Many schools did not open for a long time. And I think it is useful to reflect and ask the question, did a sort of perceived reliance on connected technologies enable schools to be closed for longer than they might have been without it? We looked at historical research to see what happened during the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. And interestingly, in that pandemic, schools were closed for much shorter periods of time. Again, it's not an apples to apples comparison, but that pandemic was also much more dangerous to children than COVID-19 at least seems to be thus far. So I wanted to sort of to maybe a little bit problematize the thesis here. The thesis is we should make connectivity a right to education. I am all for that. I think that's great. Here's my concern, is that if there is too much of a focus on connectivity, I'm worried that that will lead to a deprioritization of schooling. What is interesting and what we found is that the right to education has traditionally been understood as schooling as an in-person human experience. It is often not specified in legal text that that is what the right to education entails. When the right to education was formulated, there was absolutely no chance that it could be done remotely. It was a given that it would be a schooling experience. However, now we are seeing countries around the world prolong the school closures for much longer. And even when schools are back in effect, they're often still making huge reliance on digital technologies. For example, in the United States, I mean, a very rich and developed country, many schools are only open for 3 days a week. It's not become a sort of 5-day-a-week experience. And I think that for the past 20 years, being able to learn through connected technologies was a sign of privilege and advantage. I'm concerned that in the next 20 years, learning through digital technologies will become an education for the underprivileged and the poor, and that working with teachers and other humans will become an educational advantage. We're already seeing some signs of that. If you go to the richest cities in the world, they're often sort of tech hubs, whether that be New Delhi or London or San Francisco, or even here in Paris, where UNESCO is headquartered. The best and most expensive private schools, they market and advertise the lack of digital technology. It is about a human experience. The digital technology, that's going to come no matter what. And so they're focused on these interpersonal skills. And when you really unpack Article 26 that holds the right to education, it talks about the full development of the human personality, strengthening respect for human rights. I have to assume that the full development of human personality, I'm not sure how you do that through online only channels. So I worry that too much of a focus on connectivity as a sort of pillar of the right to education will lead to a deprioritization of schooling. And do not forget that the cost of in-person experience schooling is immensely expensive, and that digital technologies offer governments a way to sort of, to save money and other things. And I'm afraid that with the budget cuts and other things that many countries are looking at, that will become a sort of a solution. So I just wanted to kind of problematize that and say that perhaps the first step is to ensure that the right to education is a right to schooling. For example, just to a sort of hypothetical, should there be a right to unconnected education? I think that's a very interesting kind of question. People don't want to get online, can't get online. And the final factor is, I'm worried about all the narrative and the dialogue positioning education, digital technology and techno sort of centric solutions as the pillar of educational resilience. I fundamentally disagree with that. Human beings are the pillar of resilience, and building the capacity of people is how countries can become resilient to shocks and other things that we saw. And indeed, during the COVID-19 pandemic, yes, digital technologies and connectivity made a big difference. We cannot say otherwise, but it depended on highly capable individuals who were trained, who understood how to deliver distant learning pedagogies. That's a complex act. And so building the capacities of people, that needs to remain the pillar of resilience. And COVID-19 was a very specific shock, a very specific emergency, historically very rare. But we could imagine a different shock where, say, the internet went down. Schools would look like a pillar of resilience. There are 1,000 ways that connectivity can break. I sit in one of the richest neighborhoods and the richest cities and the richest countries in the world in a UN organization, and our connectivity fails on a fairly regular basis. I mean, not a regular basis, but it happens. I mean, connectivity can go out too. And as everybody knows, if you're living in a poor area, it's more likely to go. Governments can shut down connectivity. Governments can deny connectivity to certain groups. I mean, by a lot of standards, schools look incredibly resilient. They don't depend on electricity. You can walk down the street. Schools are often running even in times of conflict. They can continue to go on. So I think that what I would like to see is, yes, we want universal connectivity. Of course we do. But should maybe the right to education be first defined as a right to schooling as an in-person experience, and then secondly, then we can worry about these other branches on a right to connectivity. So thank you again for the fascinating report. It's really gotten us thinking about these issues. And it's been a pleasure to speak here today, and looking forward to questions in the other presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think you've given us a lot of stuff to think about, and I'm just going to hold those thoughts for the Q&A right after. So I'm going to hand it over to Isaam now, and we'd really like to hear a little bit about, your thoughts on the report are welcome, as well as the Pakistan's domestic protection landscape for the right to education and access to internet. And, feel free to add anything else that you'd like at this point. Thank you, and over to you.
All right, thank you, Sevim. I'd just start with, again, congratulating Fatima. And again, I've read that report cover to cover. And as Mark said, it is quite insightful. It does raise some things that I think will otherwise go unaddressed and perhaps not attract as much attention as they would. And I'm also quite intrigued by a couple of things that Mark has said. I think these are concerns, particularly with regards to the deprioritization of school opening if we do go down the route of maybe recognizing the right to internet. But that's something that we can also talk about in due course. What I want to start with is, pursuant to that report, is to explain, we've been speaking about this right to education, and Article 25A is in front of us, right? And so, and Mark too said, whether we talk about education, do we mean schooling, or do we mean something wider, say in terms of Article 26, where you talk about a considerably wider idea of education than just formal instruction and institutional learning. But Article 25A, our own constitutional landscape to begin with, and this could be a template for other jurisdictions as well, it is a very unique provision. It's added in 2010. We never had a right to education before this. right? And it's the provision itself contains a bit of a heist if you read it closely. The heist is that it says that the state shall provide free and compulsory education. And then it says that it may do so by law, right? Now that imperative, if it stopped at the imperative that the state shall provide free and compulsory education, you would have had a standalone right, constitutionally derived, and jurisprudentially you could give meaning to it. But the moment you tie it with a discretionary law of sorts, you give that leeway now, which again is essential, I suppose, in instances where you're trying to bring about provincial autonomy and ensure that the federal landscape is vibrant in as many ways as possible. But the problem that gave rise to is that when you had those laws enacted, I mean, just take the Punjab and Sindh, for instance. Punjab had the Free and Compulsory Education Act, which it doesn't quite read as well as it should. So for instance, it defines education in a very limited manner, right? It's confined to schooling. It includes madrasas, right? It includes for every type of schooling system that a 5 to 16-year-old would fall within. So that definition of education in the Punjab Act is considerably narrow. Slightly wider in Sindh, I would say, because there they talk about deeper aspects of vocational and technical training as well. I'm not sure if that, again, does complete justice to the idea of education as it should be understood. But the fact of the matter is, Article 25A, as Fatima says in her report, is not a self-executing provision. The right to education has to be given meaning. And the laws that we have at present, they do not give it the sort of meaning that could perhaps fulfill the purpose. The purpose, of course, is to get kids in school, right? I mean, forget the pandemic for just a second. If we have children in school, that's what the logic in 2010 was. And where does the problem arise? The problem arises because of the fact that for the vast majority of our existence, at least Pakistan's independence, education has been a federal subject, only became provincial in 2010. And so provinces are not trained to deal with something as vast as, let's say, the right to an education. How do you protect it? What sort of measures do you have? All of those questions are questions that ideally should be understood collectively. Some sort of harmony there is necessary. But again, it's a learning curve, obviously, for the provinces. And so at present, we do not have a uniform understanding of what education precisely comprises in any of the provinces, despite the provision of Article 25A. But the question of whether the internet is an inherent right within the educational landscape or not, right? I was intrigued to see you had this poll just now, where it was 25%, I suppose that's the final verdict, said that internet is not an essential part, right? I would beg to disagree with that for slightly different reasons. But just if we think of it in terms of the pandemic itself, if we say that the internet is not a part and parcel of the right to education, then any schooling system or educational system that was imposed during the lockdown or during the pandemic where schools were physically closed, right? All of those would be deemed to be unlawful because they failed to discriminate between those who have access to the internet and those who don't. And in a developing country like ours, especially, this sort of discrimination it continues to entrench itself. And how do you get around that problem? Now, you could, of course, say that you don't necessarily need to go the full distance of entrenching the connectivity as a right, but without that entrenchment, you see, given the deficit that I just pointed out, that we don't have a meaning or a uniform definition for education, and we do not have the right sort of standards that can uniformly apply all across the country, at least access in that sense would go a long way in getting the overall purpose achieved, right? Which is why when you read this report, I think that the where it shines, of course, in my view, is the top-down approach that she has proposed. And there's a reason why I say that, peculiar to Pakistan itself, right? So the approach, as I understand it, is that you recognize it in international convention, right? And then you also grant it some sort of recognition in your domestic systems, whether it's through the constitution itself or whether it's through policy, legislation, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a very good template to, study over the last 20, 30 years to show how this sort of a top-down approach has helped us achieve something which otherwise you would not have perhaps even given too much thought to. Now that's the environment. Environmental protection, I think, is a classic case of this top-down approach in action. You have those international conventions. Nobody in Pakistan took the environment seriously, right? Nobody did. That's something that I think there's a handful of activists. There's so much literature on this where people would be at pains to explain why environmental protection is important. They'd cite all those international conventions and literature, but nothing would happen. And then the Supreme Court, right, interpreted Article 9, the right to life, in a fairly dynamic manner and said that it includes the right to a healthy life, right, to a healthy environment. And so you had that, talking about that analogy with the top-down approach, since that judgment, where the right to a healthy environment was read into the right to life, you have had increased awareness, you have had statutory recognition of the need to protect the environment. Every province enacted, well, it was the Federation first enacted the Environment Protection Act. And today, you look at our jurisprudence, you look at the current government for that matter, right? There's a very strong commitment towards environmental protection. Now, this is the top-down approach in action, if you ask me, right? Where there's a concept, you don't have a separate right to environmental protection, you don't have a right to a clean environment spelled out in the Constitution, but it's been rooted in the right to life and has since developed, and I believe has generated the sort of discourse that should be generated. These are all questions. Rights are not ends unto themselves. They should be, reasonable disagreement about what they entail. And I therefore believe that this top-down approach, whether it's successful or not on account of, let's say, resource deficits, I do believe that it will generate the right discourse and will force actors to, pursue the right sort of measures to see how this can possibly be achieved. And so, if we talk about connectivity per se, whether it is rightly rooted or proposed to be rooted in the educational context or within the right to education, I think that there's a significant advantage to deriving such a right within the educational context, as opposed to, say, the right to life. I mean, we've stretched the right to life to its maximum limit, right? And if you read the report, she's gone through all those rulings where the right to life has been deemed to include the right to clean water, the right to health, right? So let's just say we've stretched it as much as we could. Adding more to this will only amount to some sort of token compliance. So if a court were to say today that the right to life also includes the right to a connected life, I'm pretty sure that the state will comply with that connected life with a token sort of concession to maybe, theoretically providing connectivity on paper, but not really doing much about it. So Article 9, in my view, is not the right site for having a right to connectivity. Article 14, which is the right to dignity. Dignity is something, again, which our courts are increasingly now relying on to expand the current purview of rights. Recently, on the rights of persons with disabilities, Supreme Court as well as the Lahore High Court have relied extensively on the rights to human dignity as being the basis for being more inclusive and for providing access to such persons, right? That's one option. You could perhaps say that leading a connected life is part of leading a dignified life. But that, again, doesn't quite cut it, because as I think the situation that Mark portrayed with an unconnected world, or if the internet goes down, you will still be able to function. You will still be able to do quite a few things and enjoy quite a few rights. But the beauty, if I may, of rooting this in Article 25A, the right to education, is that the moment you take it out, the moment you try to violate Article 25A, you automatically fall within that discrimination clause, right? Because any child who is being denied education because he or she is unable to, get on the internet, they will say that this is intersectional discrimination. We are being discriminated against because of our social background and because we're children, right? And that intersectional discrimination automatically leads us to the unqualified right to the right to be treated equally. And so in my view, I mean, given there's a lot of thoughts to process, of course, because like I said, there are some things about this, especially what Mark just pointed out, right, which we will have to think about, whether this will lead to deprioritizing the opening of schools, right? I think it will, at a bare minimum, prompt states, at least in developing countries. If you say that the right to connectivity is a right within the right to education, it will prompt states to ensure that whatever measures they impose or whatever measures they take to fulfill the right to education, they are as inclusive as possible. Because the purpose is to not exclude those who are unable to afford connectivity for one reason or the other. So, like I said, I mean, these are all thoughts that are still developing, but I think that from the report, as well as from my understanding of how our constitution has been interpreted and developed, I think there is, within Article 25, a ample room for finding and tracing a right to connectivity or a right to the internet. And again, I'll hand over back to Sevim for further discussion on this. Quite interested to see what the thoughts on this would be. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sam. So before I get into the question and answers, I just want to say, we really want this to be interactive. So Mark, Fatima, if you both have any comments that you want to share right off the bat, I mean, you can take it away right now. And we're happy to have that conversation back and forth as well. So please go ahead.
I had something, thanks, it's super interesting, really fascinating about different choices of where we might hang a right to connectivity and the implications of that. Just to sort of help frame our Q&A and for some other discussions, I think it's useful to consider, again, I'm not a legal specialist, I'm an educational specialist. So I think it's interesting to kind of consider some different words when we talk about, for example, the nuances between education, learning, and schooling. And this is where it gets quite interesting. I mean, learning is everything, right? Learning can be informal. We're learning all the time. I had to set my Zoom filter, here, that's a type of learning. I mean, learning can happen in school, out of school, with relatives, with parents on the street. Learning is sort of like the biggest umbrella we have. Education is different. Education is intentional, right? Education is planned learning, systematized learning. It doesn't necessarily have to happen in a school or an educational institution, but it often does. So a lot of intentional decisions. I'm being very rough. I mean, these are contested definitions. And then of course, schooling. I mean, in schooling, traditionally understood as being there is a physical place where this happens, a building, if you will, that is organized in a very specific way. They differ from, even from school to school, country to country, how that's organized. But we basically have a broad understanding that involves sort of classrooms and other things, and these, models that have grown up around schooling, especially since this big push towards, universal education and universal schooling. And so then we can think about, what are the purposes of these different things? And I would argue that we have for a long time conflated schooling and education with academic curricular learning, that it is about learning to read, it's about learning math, it's about learning, scoring well on science tests. And we're, very concerned about how countries score on PISA tests. And, we want to see people having skills and other things. But I think COVID-19 has really shocked us into remembering that education and schooling are about a lot more than curricular learning. They are places where you learn how to come into being in a community, how to deal with peers, how to interact with adults who are not in your family, how to socialize. It is places where people learn to get along with other human beings. UNESCO talks about, pillars of learning, and one of the pillars of learning is learning to live with others and in part of a community. I would also argue it is a site where people learn, how to fit in a particular culture. They learn about their culture. It is a place of acculturation. It's often a place where things like nationalism are taught. I mean, for good or for bad. But there are all sorts of latent purposes of education. What we saw is when COVID-19 hit, education narrowed to academic curricular learning. There was not a particular concern with student well-being. There was an enormous concern if so-and-so is making progress in mathematics and progress in reading, and we wanted to see the same progress that would have been made if, you know, education had been happening as an in-person schooling experience. What we didn't see was all of this concern with social emotional learning, civic learning. And I think that many people after a short period of time said, whoa, wait a minute, you know, this type of thing was also happening in isolation. And one of the legacies of this shift to digital technology is the heightened isolation that students felt. I mean, parents felt it too, but it was very hard on children. You know, there's a lot of you know, sort of people struggling with various mental issues and other things as a result of this. I mean, that is one of the great tolls of this shift. So when we talk about education, we need to be clear. Are we just talking about academic curricular learning? Or are we talking about all this other stuff that we haven't, you know, often don't sort of put in what we do? And that's why I think, sorry to be long here, but that's why I think also this concern with attendance is so profound. That if we're really honest with ourselves, what schools often care about is attendance, is looking to see that people are there sitting in a seat and learning, because that means they are getting all of these things. You know, is so-and-so here? And that's really important. They're not in the street, they're not at home, they're in this sort of other space that does other things. And interestingly, when education moved to places like Zoom, teachers were often really concerned about attendance, which seems odd because, you know, you can just quickly check attendance. But I think it's that like old memory of like, is somebody here? That's the sort of most important thing. The kids are being taken care of. You know, we are in control of them now, and now they're off of school and they can leave, or they're off of Zoom, and that's okay. And so this sort of idea of like, is education about sort of attendance, being at a particular place that's maybe not the home, maybe not the, you know, or is it about curricular learning? It depends on our objectives for education, about what we hope to get from connectivity. And I think we all saw connectivity can be pretty good at teaching certain people, older students. We often talk about connectivity as having relevance for everybody. It's not the case. I mean, try putting a 7-year-old in front of a Zoom class. It doesn't work very well. I mean, but we talk about it like it's equally relevant for university students and not, you know, young children. But, you know, it's what do we want to achieve with these sort of spaces? And once we're able to nail that down, I think we can begin to understand how connectivity fits in and doesn't fit in. But again, I would like to see a really major international push for making the right to education the right to an in-person sort of experience, because a lot of states have said they fulfilled their right to education, you know, because we put some, you know, digital learning content, we put it up on the cloud, everybody can go, you know, can go access it, and voila, you know, right to education was fulfilled, and you know, we got people a digital device who didn't have one, and you know, there we have it. So what really interesting question, what will the future of education, the future of schooling entail after this experience? And I think we saw sort of two very divergent directions where this could go. We're at an inflection point, so these conversations are very necessary. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm just going to open this up. I'm going to ask one question, and for all of our participants here and also for the panelists, if you have a question, please just feel free to use the raise hand feature on your Zoom screens, and I will hand over the mic to you and you can just ask your question directly yourself. I'm going to kick this off by just putting out, you know, right where Mark left off. This conversation today has raised a number of questions, not just on bridging the digital divide, but also on how we want to see the future of this right to education that we have. And I think the first thing that comes to my mind is how, and again, this is open to all the panelists. I just say, maybe we can limit our responses to say 2 to 3 minutes per panelist, just to make sure we get a few other questions in. How do we really move forward from where we are? And I think, Mark, I take your point right now. There seem to be 2 or 3 different ways of moving forward, but perhaps based on everyone's different area of expertise, it'd be really useful to see what are immediate next steps that can be employed to perhaps maintain the sanctity of the right to education, or to at least enable access to more people than it is currently available to. So I'm going to put that out there, and I'm going to leave it open for anyone to jump in here. Thank you.
Right. If I could start with that. Sorry, I think Fatima was also just unmuting herself. But what I was saying is the way forward, I think if we take especially what Mark has said into account and the content of the report as well, I think it's a good case for saying that there should not be any virtual platform until you have, well, as a priority at least, there should be no virtual sort of learning system or no virtual schooling, as it were, until and unless you have uniform connectivity, right? Because I think that's a threshold at which we can all agree, in the sense that good, bad, or ugly, if it's virtual, that's going to be the platform, then everybody must have access to it, right? With that said, I think that we also need, for a variety of reasons, to get that wider understanding of education that Mark has just put quite eloquently, right? It's not just, as he says, the idea of having that curricula, all those boxes checked, that wider definition. And we have so many opportunities to do this, right? We have at least 2 statutes in different provinces where they've purported to define education. And when you read those definitions, they're not that great, right? They would definitely, I'm pretty sure that Mark would have a thing or two to say about those definitions when he reads them, because they can be wider, right? They can be wider and they can be all-encompassing. And this interpretation of education, it has to be evolving. We can't just set it in stone today, or go back to the early 20th century and say, all right, that's what education is, right? There are so many things that we're still learning about education, and I think that the way forward, in my view, therefore, is to get that definitional aspect from the statutes that we have, make it as wide as possible, and then say that until and unless we can have uniform connectivity, there will be no virtual learning, because it's discriminatory otherwise. There's no equality, having a certain class of people excluded from even that virtual platform. But that's my take on it. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Fatima, do you want to add something?
Yeah, sorry, I can't find the raise hand feature, so I'm just going to go ahead. So just combining some of what Mark and some of what Isaam has said. So I think I completely agree with this wider sort of understanding of education in the first place, and not, relegating it to just attendance or just curriculum, but also education in the sense of learning. So that's something that I completely agree with. I also agree with how we define education, and while connectivity is a starting point, at the end of the day, what matters, as Mark suggests, is schooling and learning, right? And to that end, I'd just like to, sort of combine what Mark and Isaam said by perhaps suggesting that in any future delineation of the right to education, perhaps it would be best not to specify a specific means and methods of education. And perhaps it would be sustainable and have the most foresight if we just had obligations to ensure that education must be adaptable, inclusive, and equal. And then, depending on the times and depending on the circumstances, also depending on technological advancements of every era, then that right to education is so adaptable, or it's so adaptable to all sorts of changes in society, that it can easily be extrapolated to different contexts and still retain meaning and still be meaningful. So I think adaptability would really be the key here. And while connectivity is a starting point, I do foresee a future. So one future is where internet goes down completely. So then what does connectivity mean, as Mark suggests? But one future is also something beyond what we currently know as virtual learning. So for example, what about a future with learning in an ambient reality setting, which seems to be the future in terms of technology? So it's not just virtual, it's also ambient reality, which is actually experiencing what's happening around you, as opposed to just seeing and hearing. So then how do we define education? And then do we keep coming back with new modes and methods and try to fit them into a definition of education? Or do we have the concept of education so flexible and so adaptable that it's, it can adapt to all of these different changes? Because a lot of these changes we can foresee, but a lot of them we can't foresee. So I think that's really important, really building in the sustainability aspect into however we decide to frame the conversation and discourse around the future of education. Yeah, thank you.
If I can maybe just follow on Isaam and Fatima, and I think Fatima, an interesting idea about, maybe the right to education is not sort of defined in terms of means and methods, with an understanding that it is constantly evolving. Personally, I'm a little nervous about that approach, but nevertheless a very interesting idea. If I can also just sort of back up to give the context, I mean, we often forget that pre-COVID, there were a huge number of students who could not access education at all. They're out of school. In Pakistan, those numbers were very, very high. So, I mean, even this traditional way, we never got it even close to universal in a lot of countries. And that means people attending school. So that's one pillar, if you will, attendance, being in school. Now, the other one is actual learning, curricular learning. And when you look at that, it becomes really abysmal. That people after 5 years of schooling cannot read a single sentence, cannot solve a basic arithmetic problem. This kind of World Bank idea of learning poverty. So that even in places where we did have formal education and schooling, learning was not occurring. And that also seems like an affront to the right to education to me, that you are attending an institution, yet you're not benefiting from it, at least in any academic curricular way. I would argue that there are other benefits, that we talked about, the social emotional aspects and other things that probably are conferring at least some sort of benefit. But that there is learning gains that are occurring as a result of schooling. And a final point I wanted to bring in about connectivity is, this report that we'll publish in coming up just a little bit later this year. It's all about what happened when education moved to technology. It's called an EdTech tragedy, to try to capture the sort of unintended loss and harm that resulted from this process. But let's not forget that at least our current models for moving education into digital spaces is entirely reliant on corporate for-profit providers. What actually happened when education shifted into digital spaces? It meant that the device you use to access education is privately controlled. The connection itself is privately controlled. The platform that you are on, whether that's Google Classrooms, Microsoft Teams, or another one, privately controlled. The data wound up in places that are controlled by people that have a reputation for profiting off of data and using that data to make money. It need not be, but the current model of digitizing education is one of privatizing education. And at UNESCO, we look at education through a lens of, it is not education just for me, it is education for us. It is about a collective and a public good. And education cannot just become another wing of a commercial market. It is too important. It is too necessary. It must exist outside of this sort of market profit loss logic. It is about realizing a common good. That's what our UNESCO's Futures of Education report is all about. Is about the importance of reaffirming education's value as a common good. It is a collective good. It does something for all of us beyond just individuals. That is why it is publicly provisioned. So again, this sort of, I think, maybe premature push. We need universal connectivity. I mean, the internet is amazing. We love it. We like our phones. It's incredible. It's impressive. But we also need to be clear-eyed that pushing it there now often entails further privatizing education, which many people, I think, astutely observe, is already dangerously privatized already. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. So I'm just going to hand over to Uzma, who has a question, and then to Javeria as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sevim. Hi, everyone. I'm Uzma. My question is for Mark, although my question is formulated through the conversation, through Isaam's recommendations, as well as Fatima's very interesting recommendation that perhaps we can have education in a metaverse. So I really like your interpretation that right to education could perhaps encompass right to schooling, as well as, and then that's whether how connectivity plays a part within education is a secondary question, and a question that we need to answer once we've already put in the safeguards for technology to operate in a way that's good. So right now, the assumption is that technology is a human good, although we haven't really made much efforts or many efforts into making it a human good. So I also liked your point about whether or not we should think that there should be a right to disconnect when it comes to the right to education. So it reminded me of how that's a similar problem that we're having with digital IDs right now. So there is a move from there's a universal or global move that everyone needs to have legal identity, but governments have started to advocate for a misplaced assumption that right to digital identity is what is right to legal identity means. So people have to have digital ID in order to be recognized as individuals legally, which isn't right, because having a digital ID has problems of its own. I mean, if we look at India's Aadhaar program, we can see how many inequalities surface through that. And the similar problem might arise in Pakistan too, now that we're moving towards digital ID. So the safeguards aren't in place, but the technology is developing. So when we think of the futures of education, then how do we fight this global assumption that technology is the way forward? Technology is the way forward only once we develop it as a human good. So without those safeguards, how do we move forward? How do we challenge those assumptions of governments and private companies who want to capitalize on technology without putting in those safeguards? So how do we realize a right to education or a right to schooling and have that human experience so how do we challenge those assumptions and realize a right to education then that can sort of enhance that human experience, and what we've been experiencing so far isn't diminished, and it can be taken forward, and something that technology could then enhance further. So what would be the next step globally is what I'm trying to ask.
Thanks a lot, Usman. I imagine Fatima and Isaam might want to say something to that too. I think you were directing it to me, so I'll just take a quick crack. The points you raised are really relevant, and they're points we're trying to raise, certainly with this report that will come out in a little later this year. But to think about, how do we avoid this? One issue I think is there have been major initiatives in the UN to connect schools. That was actually, if you look back to pre-COVID, that was the primary sort of push. It was like, let's connect all schools and assure the right to education, through schooling. This pandemic has really sort of muddled that landscape, because of course, connected schools didn't matter in this context. You had to have connectivity reach all the way to the home and to individuals. Obviously that should maybe be the end goal. That would be, it's an advantage to have connectivity follow me around on my phone, not just have it at this sort of formal institution of learning. But I think that maybe a first step could be to ensure connectivity to schools. We're not even close to that globally. I mean, not even remotely close. So maybe that becomes sort of a first area priority, and will keep the focus on schooling as an in-person experience. And again, give schools a chance to kind of move into the digital, this digital world that we live in. It's important. It's, we want people to discover new forms of pedagogy. I think it's also interesting because there is nothing that says that digital learning needs to be me and my device and nobody else in a quiet room. There are all types of really interesting pedagogies that involve multiple people using digital devices. I've been to education conferences and I see people build table-length tablet computers where kids can work together and do different things. It's not just, anti-social, isolated other things. that model actually tends to be very good for profitability. It's very good to target advertising. Don't forget that that one-to-one scenario is, it stems from a sort of corporate model that's convenient to certain, people with influence and with profit at stake. So I think this idea of maybe connecting schools as a first step could be something that we that we build on, and maybe that can become something like a branch of the right to education. Anyway, we all need to think through this, but your question raised that idea, and thanks for it. Over.
Fatma, Isaam, any comments on this? If not, we can move on to the next question as well.
Yeah, so just a brief comment on Uzma's question. So we understand that safeguards are extremely important and that there's a real concern as far as privacy and surveillance and all of these issues are concerned, especially with digital education, virtual education for younger children. So that's very, very important. Those issues are relevant and important. However, the point that the report also makes in certain parts where it recognizes these problems and tries to, propose what the potential solutions to these problems could be. So it recognizes that there are all these competing interests, all these foreseeable problems in implementation, which have to do with the cyberspace, which have to do with surveillance, which have to do with privacy concerns, which have to do with privatizing education and with capitalizing on education. However, while those concerns are understood and recognized, it is important at the same time to understand that they should not technically hamper the realization of this right in the first place, or they should not technically hamper the movement towards realizing connectivity in education, because it is only after we make that recognition in the first place can we then have a meaningful discourse around safeguards. So of course, the conversation does not have to stop there, but I do believe that it's the right starting point. So if we get to that starting point, then I think it's really, really important to have these conversations side by side, as well as when we get there, about how to best ensure that this right is safe and it's secure and it's safeguarded, and all of these other concerns are mitigated and managed to some extent. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add to this question. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'm just so Javeria had a question in the comment box. Javeria, do you want to go ahead and ask the question directly? If not, I can definitely pass it forward as well. Yeah.
No, yes, I just had another, like the portion of another question. Hi everyone, this is Javeria. So the first question I think that is imperative to even the people who have studied during COVID online is that when it comes to enforcement and resources, we see that we don't have them, and of it as a separate issue. And given those problems, do you think during the time that this legal aspect is now developing, the universities or the institutes on which the students are part and who are being paid actually for that education, should they chip in to, for instance, in our university, we were given logins for the Microsoft accounts all across the university when the global pandemic hit and when we went online. So that helped us stay online and helped us stay connected to the team. And also I have a question for, Sir Isaam. So we talked about the importance of the Shehla Zia case, if I'm not wrong, and how it was a watershed moment in increasing the right to life to include the right to a healthy environment, a better enjoyment of your rights. So do you think we should wait for that watershed moment in this educational aspects, or should we, like we have suggested, just go forward with the general course of legislation, or does judicial interpretation have to be done in order to facilitate this move?
So if I could just jump in on the first part of the question, and Isaam can take a lead on the latter bit. So Javeria, you're concerned about resources and what role do private entities, including education institutions, have to play in it. Now, the report explicitly points out that public-private partnerships are integral, and they're very, very important in sort of realizing this right. That forms a key part of our recommendations as well, that it's not just government responsibility, but it can best be manifested through public-private partnerships. So for example, even in some of the higher education institutes in Lahore, we did see that when learning moved online, there was certain allocation of resources, whether that included laptops, to students who were from outside Lahore or who were from, other areas of Lahore. So that did happen. However, you're absolutely correct that that obligation should be a combination and should be shared between public and private entities if it is to be, optimally realized in the future. And yeah, that's it from my side.
Yeah, so if I could just, briefly on the first part of your question as well, as far as resource allocation is concerned, of course, there are some sort of duties which were termed ex ante duties, where you say that these are duties that exist, and then lack of resources is not an excuse. Now, of course, for a developing country like ours, that's lack of resources is very much an excuse. It's very much something that is a pressing problem, and we have to prioritize. The government has to prioritize a number of things, and to the extent to which we can have the private sector make contributions to that, there is regulation of private schools in all the provinces, right? But that regulation or the scope of that regulation is wide enough for them to actually ask them to make contributions. So just to give you an example, in Sindh, the law as it stands today is that a private school has to take what we call a disadvantaged student in free of cost. And the definition of a disadvantaged student is, it includes, a number of things about the income bracket that the family comes from, et cetera, et cetera. And in addition to that, they also have the power to then impose or raise funds through those private schools. So I think when that need arises, there is legal scope for private schools to make those contributions to the infrastructural requirements of having that connectivity there. As for the second part of your question, I mean, the Shell Azhar case proved to be a watershed case because of what followed, right? Because of how it was then perceived, because then people started taking environmental rights seriously, and to this day, they continue to do that. And so I would say that, well, of course, nobody should be waiting for a watershed moment. I think that given our peculiar circumstances, where judicial review is routinely resorted to, even for the initiation of legislative measures, I think there's ample room for anyone to approach the court, any aggrieved student, to say that my right to education is not being fulfilled. Bring that definition of education in front of the court and bring the contours so that at least there's some interpretation of what education means. If life can mean things as wide as right to a healthy life, prosperous life, et cetera, education, we can have so many conversations on what education actually means. And again, if that does come, we'll be sure to, of course, get a lot of input from the UNESCO program, as well as some other ideas. And so the point that I'm trying to make, therefore, is that this is a case it's an issue that's ripe for that sort of judicial determination. And if the court comes to the conclusion that the current landscape is not meeting the rights to education or not fulfilling that constitutional mandate, it can issue directions even for amendments to that law or amendments to the current system, right? Of course, this is unique to our jurisdiction, South Asian jurisdictions in particular, where public interest litigation has been on the rise for quite some time. But it's because of these inequities that public interest litigation arises in the first place. So I'm not prompting you to enter some sort of PIL here, right? But I'm just saying that, no, we can't wait around, right? Some forum has to agitate this issue so that it's taken seriously. That's my take on it. Thank you.
Mark, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in and also say that when we're talking about, the point I made about education, we need to think about its sort of purposes, but also its processes. My favorite educational philosopher is John Dewey, and he said that education is not preparation for life, it is life itself. We have to remember that we're making decisions about process of education, about who we want to be, how we want to live. And I would argue that, this COVID mode of learning, it may have been super efficient. I maybe won't even deny that, like, if I sit in front of a digital device and I'm hammering away at mathematics or language, I might learn faster than in a classroom, school environment. but that environment is dehumanizing to me in certain ways. It's lonely, it's isolating. It only engages two of my senses, my audio and my visual. There's no touch, there's no smell, there's no taste, there's no people. The UNESCO Futures of Education observes that, education going forward really needs to think about our relationship with each other, our relationship with technology, and our relationship with the environment. And, shifting education into digital spaces, yes, may be efficient, yes, may be effective, but is that the kind of human experience that we want? In Korea and other countries that are very far along with digital learning, they had an initiative, this is pre-COVID, to make all textbooks digital. So like all sort of education materials will be digital, it'll be green, it'll, be more efficient, it'd be great. And a lot more schooling was going to happen online. Guess who pushed back against it? Parents, because they said, school is the one place where my kids are not spending hour upon hour upon hour staring at a screen. They are finally living in an offline world that is more enriching, and they're learning certain things in that offline world, and they're becoming human. Maybe our future of humans will be in digital spaces and metaverses and other things. I'm not sure, but we should recognize it's a conscious decision that we can make. And I think it's also interesting to observe that what are the most privileged people in society doing? What decision are they making? They're very much making the decision that the education for their children should be in person, should be physical, should be human to human. During COVID, some of the richest families in the world, they established what are called learning pods. So they got together with their neighbors and built a school that was effectively a shadow education system so that their kids could continue learning in this really rich way that they understood. They ditched the digital learning. So I just want to kind of leave us with this idea that education is also not just preparation for sort of life. It is life itself. And what type of experience do we want that to entail? And this legal architecture that we establish around it will point us in different directions. Over.
Thanks so much, Mark. So I know we're really short on time, but I'm just we have one other question. We're going to take this last question. And Ali, can I request that you keep the question as short as possible? And I'm going to give all of our panelists around 1.5 minutes to just close this up at the right time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for taking my question. So hello, everyone. I just had one question on the privatization element that Mark discussed. So he alluded to how this could be a possible issue that arises out of recognizing right to internet access or the right auxiliary to the right to education. So what then is a possible middle ground that can be adopted to incorporate virtual connectivity into modern pedagogy, but at the same time not deprioritize in-person schooling?
Shall I attempt a 1 minute answer?
I think we'd save a lot of the world's problems if we had that in a 1 minute answer, but I think that's what we're gonna have to do today. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, I'll try to make it very brief. Ali, thanks for the question. It's a great question, and it's a big question, and it's one that we all need to think about. Look, the 1 minute answer is where are the public spaces for public education on the internet? The only example I can come up with this sort of non-corporately controlled, really rich digital space is Wikipedia. And guess when that was made? In the 1990s. Where are the public spaces for public education on the internet? It's a great question. Schools are not privately held, corporately owned, other things like where's the Zoom that's built by the Pakistani government for education? Where's the Google Classroom that's built for education through public resources and is democratically controlled? And the reliance on private providers cannot be overstated. I mean, imagine if Google Classroom just tomorrow decided, this is not really part of our corporate strategy, it's not really working, we're going to take it down. I mean, that would disrupt the education of literally hundreds of millions of students. There is nothing that says that won't happen. We see that they make decisions all the time to shift resources. And remember that we did a calculation, the top 3 tech companies in the world have a greater market capitalization than the entire world spends on education per year. So when you're saying, oh no, Google Classroom is very important to Google, I'm not so sure that that's part of their, their prioritization. So again, where are the public spaces for public education on the internet? Thanks.
Fatma, Isaam, any last comments?
I just have like one very brief comment on Ali's question and Mark's response as well. Where are the public spaces for public education on the internet? So in our research, while we were researching for this particular publication, we did find that the Federal Ministry of Education, when it launched the Teleschool and Radio School program, simultaneously, it also launched a bunch of EdTech platforms, which were available free of cost for the public. But then the point that the report makes is that just having those EdTech platforms out there on the internet is not sufficient if people aren't able to access those EdTech platforms. So those sort of public education spaces were there, but then there was a question of accessibility. And so I'm not sure how this played out in different other jurisdictions, but there was this element of having these public EdTech platforms available for everyone to use. But then the point that the report sort of seeks to make is that there's no purpose to having an EdTech platform or to having stuff digitized and have put it on a website if the people who need it most cannot access it in the first place. So that's just one bit that I wanted to add in response to that question. Thank you.
Isaam, any closing comments?
No, I think that we've had a lot of insightful responses to that, and I do agree that the scope for incorporating technology in a way that does not disrupt that personal development that everybody should have through an education is something that I don't think can be answered even through a closing comment. But I'll just say that it's definitely food for thought, something that we should be working towards and seeing how we can solve that. Right? Thanks.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'd just like to thank all of you, our participants, the panelists, for your time and for your thoughts. I think it's been a really fascinating conversation, especially because we're getting to hear all the different viewpoints, not just in terms of jurisdiction, but also in terms of sector experts. So I think it also raises a really good question for me in terms of how often do we have conversations with different stakeholders that are coming in from a completely different perspective to actually enable us to think more holistically on these really important issues like the right to education. So I think one of the key takeaways for me at this point is the need for perhaps more engagement with one another, both virtually and in person. But it's just something that I think has been really fascinating to hear about these different ideas that perhaps I did not envisage when I started the conversation. So I think this has been a great learning experience for everyone. We will definitely reach out to all of our participants and the panelists with key takeaways from this seminar and perhaps a way to move forward from here. We'd love to stay engaged with you, and you can reach out to us. We have your information. You have access to at least one of our informations. So, you can feel free to reach out to us. And thank you again for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate you hosting us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Mark,
you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.